they didn't, the space it takes up is very small. It would have made a most fantastic
Right.
thing to do at the P&E grounds when they tore down some of the buildings and made it a park there.
Yeah.
It's just something that should be there at the park, at the P&E grounds, and something that we have to do. We have to recognize it.
Well, that's the one thing the University of Washington did for us. And it was quite an impressive ceremony that they had. And we...
What number of you were, no, you said there were 400?
Yeah.
Did 400 show up, or were 400 invited?
Oh, no, they didn't all show up. Some had passed on.
And that's why I was wondering, what percentage of you were still alive, type of thing?
There quite a few showed up, and they were family, not those. Sometimes it would be family members that were there.
Oh, so your son, if you hadn't been alive, for instance, Kaz could have gone and got it?
Yeah.
Okay. Because it's...
But it was quite an impressive ceremony. And we enjoyed it. I mean, I was sitting there in the front row.
Well, I think you've been in a lot of front rows in your life. Okay, so you've graduated from Oberlin.
Yeah.
You don't stay around for your graduation ceremony.
That's right.
You go to Washington so you can be one of the first people there.
Yeah.
It's interesting how, I have this weird life doing tax returns, as you know, and he's passed on too. But one of my clients was a fellow that actually was one of the 13 people in the plaque on the USS Missouri that accepted the Japanese surrender in 1945 November. And it's just amazing how many people pass through Vancouver and so on. He actually was on a boat to Alaska, and he fell in love with a lady in West Vancouver, and he married her and sold out his house in Taos, New Mexico, moved to West Vancouver, and died with a smile on his face. But it's interesting because there are so many people around that touch these historic moments, and they're all being lost. They're all being lost. It's something. So you got yourself a degree, but you weren't there to get it. You had to wait until 2008 to get something from this one. You became an economist. What was the degree you got at Oberlin? Was it in economics? Or
yes, it was in economics.
You've forgotten about Harvard.
Okay.
No, we're getting
we haven't
there.
got there yet. All right.
So
you finished Oberlin, you get to Seattle, and then you go to Harvard?
Well, yes, but first I went back to Seattle, and I ended up...
So that the audience knows, behind every man is a good woman. And Kenji's wife, Susan, is sitting over here prompting us and giving me ups and down signals here when we got to go someplace. So that's why it's getting as good as it is. And of course, Paul Swingle, who's going to be here at 8 o'clock to talk about mind stuff and closed head injuries and dementia and that type of thing. He was actually a Harvard professor too. So, what are we doing? Living room in North Vancouver, we got 2 Harvard people.
Well, I went back to Seattle after Oberlin. I mean, as I said, I went back and spent time there. Worked around, and the University of Washington students were very good in offering me space in their dormitories, etc. Well, in the initial adjustment, I even got a job as a longshoreman. This is during the war.
A skinny guy like you was a longshoreman?
Well, now wait a minute. Of course, there was a labor shortage. Remember?
Okay, so
wartime.
they're taking just anybody, were they?
Well, not only, but remember Terry Bridges also, who's the head of the union, the West Coast Longshoremen's Union, was very much a, shall we say, a liberal organization who wanted to give everybody a chance. But because of the war, I couldn't work on the waterfront.
Okay.
So I was in the storage or whatever
Warehouse area.
warehouse areas off the waterfront,
Yeah.
and working with a group of blacks from the South who had moved out to the West Coast for opportunities. And that was, to me, the most, amazing experience, to watch a group of blacks from the South working where there is no immediate supervision.
Mm-hmm.
I have never seen anybody work so slowly.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely slowly. I mean, it took more energy to hold yourself at this pace
At this space than
than it
just
would
to
have
keep on
been
walking. Okay.
to walk at a reasonable pace.
And it wasn't even a union site, or it was a union
Well,
site.
yes, it was a
union site.
Well, it was Harry Bridges' union,
Yeah,
and
okay.
Harry Bridges was a well-known humanitarian, a person who believed in equal treatment for all people.
Yeah.
And thus you didn't find the blacks there because they were forced to work there or anything. It was just that they had no discrimination in terms of union
Well,
discrimination.
there's a whole other story, and I could get into another story, because I was actually a freedom rider back in the 60s, and someplace in this house I have a July 1865 New York Times newspaper, an original newspaper. And in it has a story of the blacks starving to death because the Civil War is over.
Oh, yeah.
They've been freed, and they don't have a job, and they don't have any money, and there's no food. And they actually were literally, families and children were starving to death because they wouldn't work. The concept of working for pay hadn't quite come across, and it's an amazing article. But that's a whole other story. And, we're sitting here with a first, I was going to say, an African American president, and talking about some of these racial things that took place in this continent and so on. But it takes place everywhere, because you were in Uganda. We're going to talk. I want to get into Uganda in a second, because our next door neighbor here is a Ugandan refugee. Although he's actually passed, and the children are there, but the children were the daughter who's next door was born there and expelled in the Ugandan deal. So we only got 5 minutes left, 6 minutes left. You're kidding. We're gonna have to bring Kenji back one of these days, aren't we? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's go quick then. How did you end up in Uganda? You apparently went to Harvard.
Well, yes, I went. Well, Uganda, I got a job. I was working for, I decided, I ended up teaching at Western Washington
just
State
across
College,
the border, yes, okay.
right across the border. And then I decided, and they had a contract arrangement funded by CEDA, or by the UND, the
U.S. equivalent.
U.S.
of CEDA,
equivalent.
which is the Canadian International Development Agency. The CEDA is the Canadian International.
Yeah, I know CEDA's Canadian.
Yeah, and the UN one.
In Pakistan.
Oh, okay.
And at an institution, Haley College in Pakistan. And so a friend of mine had gone, and I'm there who was teaching at Pullman, and said, well, why don't you come over and try it for a year? So I said, okay, I'll try. Took leave from the University of Washington State, went over, and got totally frustrated. Nobody spoke English. The few who had some English couldn't speak well. I gave an exam. Students were taking textbooks and writing out of them. I took one of the students into the principal and said, look, this guy's cheating. What do we do? He says, oh, well, that's something everybody does. Forget it.